Instead of buying cards right before the season to speculate when everyone is excited about that sport and prices are at all-time highs, what I like to do instead is, if you're loading up on cards right before the season begins, you need to understand what you're actually betting on, because you're not betting on the player to go out and be good. You're betting on them to go out and exceed the card market's already high expectations, and that's a completely different bet. This is one of the most expensive mistakes card investors make, and most people don't realize they're making it until it's already too late and they're upside down on the cards they just bought. In this video, I'm going to show you what the data actually says about preseason pricing. We'll talk about why most players can't live up to expectations, and then I'll show you a couple of alternatives to consider doing instead so you're not always buying at peak pricing. My name's Ryan Seaver. I'm a longtime card investor, and I always thought the learning curve in this market sucked, and so I make videos like this so that you don't have to learn the hard way like I had to do. All right, let's get started. So what most people do when they step into the card market is they start with what seems obvious. They use their knowledge of sports and they say, okay, I know sports, I know the players, I know that this guy's really good, I think he's going to have a big year, and so I'm going to buy his cards leading into the season so that when he has a big year, lots of people are going to want his cards, values will go up, and I'll sell for a profit and live happily ever after. Does that sound familiar at all? Because I bet you've tried it, right? So effectively, we're speculating on player performance if that's the strategy that we're rolling out. We're buying a card and we need the player to play a certain kind of way on the field if we want its value to rise. Now here's the problem. It seems smart, right? Like in the moment, why wouldn't that work? But here's the thing. There's already a level of performance expectations baked into card values when you're making that purchase in the preseason. And so translating that to English, we're already expecting players to play a certain kind of way when they step onto the field. So if we buy an Aaron Judge card in March and he goes out and hits 40 home runs, it's likely not going to actually impact his card values a whole lot because we're already expecting that level of performance from him. That's why we're paying top dollar for his cards, because we've seen him hit 40 and 50 home runs year after year after year. So that's already priced in to the values of his cards right now. It's the reason why he outsells some of the guys that only hit 20 or 30 home runs in a season. And so he could put up a 40 home run season, he could even win the MVP award, but if he's not putting up numbers that exceed the card market's expectations, his values aren't going to see a massive jump. Now, if he goes out and hits 60 home runs, that's a different story, right? Because we're expecting him to hit 40, 50. We're not necessarily expecting him to hit 60. So there's a big difference there between having a good year versus actually exceeding the market's expectations. One of those raises card values, the other does not. And here's the kicker. If your player falls short of expectations, a lot of times that's when we see values fall off the cliff once the games actually get started. Now, I'm using baseball as an example, but this happens in every single sport. And what we see is all the attention comes back to that sport right before the season gets going. People are drafting their fantasy teams. Everyone's excited about their favorite team. Now, the hardest part about this is the preseason is this magical time when anything's possible, right? We see maximum hype for those up and coming prospects and rising stars. We see maximum excitement around the MVP candidates and the guys who could maybe take that leap into the next category of stardom. And so in the preseason, values absolutely soar because everyone's excited and there's zero accountability for any of those expectations yet. Now, once the games start, everything changes, and no longer is it the hype or the excitement anymore that drives values. It's performance that by far and away takes over as the number one variable that impacts values. Now, I can't predict the future, but I've invested in cards for almost 20 years, and I can tell you that I've seen this pattern happen year after year after year, every single year for every single season for the past 20 years. So I think there's a pretty good chance that that's going to continue to happen moving forward here. And so a little saying to remember, where attention goes, cash flows. All this attention is coming back to the market before the season. And so ultimately what this means is that there are going to be relatively high prices during the preseason for each sport. For a lot of players, it's actually the highest pricing they'll see all year. And so imagine if you're loading up on cards of this player at all-time high pricing, or at least the highest pricing for the year. That's a really tricky spot to be if you're trying to make money with cards because you're putting your eggs into one basket and one basket alone, which is that you need the player to go out and do something magical on the field. You can absolutely win this way if you get it right. It's just that far more players do not live up to those crazy, lofty expectations of the preseason than those who actually do. By the way, if you get value from this type of card strategy content, I post this stuff all the time, so make sure you take 2 seconds to hit the subscribe button. And so, what do we do with this information, right? So, you got to understand the pattern first of all. And so, when you look and kind of zoom out on the market for each sport, typically what we see is cards start to soften on the way out of the season, and it's not in the off season. It's typically before people realize it's on the way out of the season. For the players on teams that didn't make the playoffs or they get knocked out of the playoffs early, those guys fall out of sight and out of mind, and that's often an opportunity where you can jump in and get really good cards at really good prices that you won't see again. Now, it's not every player, so you're going to have guys that make deep playoff runs and their values may not come down at all. But for the vast majority of players, there's an opportunity to buy at a relatively low price point late in the season and in the early offseason. And then as the new season approaches, that's when all the attention comes back to the market. That's when the excitement and the hype blows out of control, and we see values continue to climb higher and higher until the games begin and players have to prove that those expectations were legitimate. And so don't take my word for it. Let's look at some actual data here so you can see what I'm talking about. So I'll take you back to Jackson Holliday, who was the top prospect in all of baseball. He was a number one overall draft pick a couple of years ago. So this is the card ladder index. And you can see how in 2024, leading into the season here in February and March, right before the season begins, right? He's at all-time high values here. And then the season starts and he hits under 200 for the year as a rookie, and his values absolutely plummet. And then if you see here, there's a little bit of pickup going into the next season, but then once again, he falls short of expectations and his values fall yet again. So this is a perfect example of a guy who had super high expectations, number one overall pick, number one prospect. He's still young. He's still got a chance to be a good Major League Baseball player, but for the expectations that were set for him, he did not live up to them, at least not yet. And so that's why we saw his values fall off of a cliff. Let's talk through another example. So Jackson Churio, very similar chart, right? So he has a little bit of a rise going into the 2024 season here in February and March, and then he underwhelms people with his performance and he falls off. And then later in the season, people realize like, well, hold on, this guy is actually having a decent year. So he actually starts picking up a little bit later in the season. It's just that if you are the person that's buying way up here and then values immediately do this, and you're holding these cards at absolute top dollar, that's a really tough position to be in. And then you can see the same pattern happens again. So, here we are in March of 2025, where his values pick up again going into the following season. And then once again, kind of under delivers, right, from a performance standpoint. And so you see his values fall back down. Now, here we are again going into the 2026 season, and his values are starting to pick back up a little bit, right? So it's the same pattern that you see over and over and over again with any of these players that are perceived to have some upward trajectory. So going into the season, values rise. If they underperform, values fall. A lot of times, if they're still young and projectable, you'll see the following season values will rise again because people are still willing to bet on them. Now, if the same pattern continues to happen, or for some guys, they only get one shot and they don't perform, people move on. There's always another guy to bet on. And so if you swing and miss 3-4 seasons in a row, you kind of become old news and you get thrown onto the scrap heap of failed prospects. Even if you settle in and become a decent average everyday starter in the majors, that's not necessarily the type of thing that's going to drive card values forward, because people aren't looking for players that are average regulars. They're looking for stars. And they like to speculate on the players that are perceived to have that star upside, that star potential. So let's look at one more example here of this type of player. So Christian Campbell. So going into the 2025 season, he was on the rise. A lot of people liked him as a prospect. Not very many people expected him to make the majors out of spring training, but he did. And so he actually got to the Red Sox and started off the season pretty strong up here for the first few weeks. But then he fell off of a cliff performance wise, and he actually ended up with a negative WAR, negative wins above replacement. And you can see the impact on his values that had. He fell off of a cliff, right? And so imagine, again, being the person that's buying at the absolute peak up here, his all time high values, just to see him end up kind of floundering in the majors and struggle against major league pitching. And ultimately, he falls off 70, 80%. That's not the type of investment we want to make, right? And it's not just the prospects and those rising star type of players either. This can happen to anyone. So Corbin Carroll, a guy who won the Rookie of the Year in 23, he had big expectations going into 24, and you can see the relative peak up here. And then he was terrible the first half of 2024. So his values, once again, fall off of a cliff here. They were down by almost 50% over the course of a few months, and then climbing back up going into the following season. And then he actually had a good 2025. So you can see a little bit of rise here, and then they kind of flatten out. But again, at this point, Corbin Carroll's an established star, and this can even happen to him. Julio Rodriguez, another guy that's sort of been in that rising star category for a few years, and you see the exact same type of pattern. So in 2024, going into the season, relative peak. He underperforms, values fall. And you can see kind of the little bit of upward curve right at that time here is February and March timeframe right before the season begins. So it's the same pattern year after year after year. Once again, in 2025, he underperformed again. Values fall. Guess what? We're going into the 2026 season here toward the end of the chart, and values are back up again. So it's the same up and down pattern for these guys that are perceived to have that upward trajectory. Now, what about a super established player like Mike Trout? So we already know he's going to the Hall of Fame no matter what he does. Absolutely outstanding career. But guess what? Even Mike Trout is not immune to the seasonal timing game. So 2023 going into the 2024 season, you see the kind of the movement up here, relative peak, and then he had some injury issues, wasn't as good as advertised, falls off of a cliff value-wise. Guess what? February, March timeframe here in 2025, same thing. Values pick back up. People get excited going into the season. Oh, he's going to be healthy again. He comes out strong. And then guess what? He gets hurt again, and we have values fall even lower. So even a guy like Trout is not immune to the seasonal swings here. And you might say, well, that's not fair. That's not a fair comparison because he got injured. That's different than underperforming. Guess what? It doesn't matter. An injury is part of the risk that you take when you're someone that's holding cards into the season. So you got to consider performance against expectations as well as injury risk. Because it doesn't matter why they fell short of expectations, it just matters that they fell short of expectations. And so I don't share this to scare you, but if you're someone that's paying top dollar for cards of guys like Roman Anthony, who's up 500% over the past couple of years, and he's at current all-time high pricing, or a guy like Connor Griffin, who was a $250 Chrome Auto PSA 10, and recent sales of him at the time of this recording at least are in the $1,500 range. Like we're talking about a 5-6x on his prices over the course of one single year. Guys, I don't know. These guys are top prospects for a reason. Lots of scouts like them quite a bit. But if you're paying absolute top dollar for these guys, it just puts you in a really difficult spot where they've got to do some serious work on the field for you to have a chance for your values to rise even higher than those prices that you're paying here. And so don't get me wrong, I like both of these guys quite a bit. And there's other names, like these are just a couple of examples, but I've got cards of these guys even. It's just that I didn't pay absolute top dollar for them. And I want to be clear, it's not to say that you can't win, right? So we can look at a couple of examples of guys that have gone into the season and had a great year that exceeded all expectations and their cards blew up. So an example of this is Pete Crow Armstrong in the 2025 season, where you see he's really flat for a whole year here where people are thinking, all right, this guy, decent prospect, but he's not a star. Well, yeah, he is when he goes out and has an all-star caliber season in 2025 and was looking like a borderline MVP candidate for a big part of the year. His values jumped a ton and he's up over 100% as a result. Another example of this, Cal Raleigh, big dumper. He is up over 1,000% after having his monster season and hitting all those home runs that nobody was expecting. And so you can see these charts show you that it's absolutely possible if you land on the exact right player. Here's the thing. Did anyone really expect Cal Raleigh to go out and do that? Maybe a couple people did, but I don't think so, guys. I don't think we were expecting to see a 60 home run season from a guy that was, 20 to 30 home run guy for the past couple of years prior to that. Same thing with Pete Crow Armstrong. Good prospect, but not that many people were expecting him to go out and put up MVP numbers in the first part of the 2025 season. And you'll notice that those are good players, but not guys that people thought of as the tier one stars of the game. So these are kind of less known players that went out and just crushed expectations. So something clicked and they did things that we haven't seen them do before. And that's what it took for the card market to respond the way that it did by paying way more for their cards. Now, it would also be unfair of me to not show that there are examples of some of the true superstars of the game rising over time. And what we tend to see is guys like Paul Skeens, who I think most people would agree is top pitcher in the game, maybe top three at least. Aaron Judge, obviously one of the best hitters that we've ever seen. Shohei Ohtani doing things that we've never seen before with his pitching and hitting combo. And so the pattern here is that typically the best of the best cards of the best players tend to rise over time. That's the number one thing that people want in the card market. That's where all the big money goes. There's a disproportionate amount of money put in the top cards of the top players. And so, yeah, you're going to see those kinds of names rise over time, especially as they continue to put up monster season after monster season. But you got to keep in mind that Shohei Ohtani, Aaron Judge, Paul Skeens, those guys are the exception. They're not the rule. There are not very many of those guys. You can count them on one hand. And for every Judge, there are 1,000 guys out there that used to be top prospects that never really panned out, never really became stars. And so, yeah, it might have worked if you had bought Judge cards early and held them forever. Great, you're going to do really well on those. But so many of these other players, you're just going to end up stuck holding the bag if you're buying at all-time high pricing because they're just not Aaron Judge. They're not going to do that. So the caution here is that if you're speculating on player performance, you got to be really careful that you're not paying all-time high pricing on a guy that has really no chance to live up to the expectations of the card market. And again, I'm using baseball as an example here, but this applies to every single sport. So if you look at football over the past few years. Going into 2025, JJ McCarthy cards were up a ton. Then he comes out flat the first couple games, gets hurt, and it's week 9 before he's even back on the field. And his cards plummeted during that time. The year prior to that, guys like Anthony Richardson, Will Levis were supposed to be big deals, and they came out, started for their teams, weren't as good as advertised, dealt with some injuries, and those guys' cards are in the toilet compared to where they used to be. The year before that, Trevor Lawrence was the talk of the town going into the season. His values were at all-time highs, and if you held his cards, you would be very upset because they fell off of a cliff when he underwhelmed everyone. You can keep going on and on. Mac Jones, Trey Lance, Zach Wilson, Kenny Pickett, Desmond Ridder. Like, all these guys were supposed to be good, and none of them ended up panning out, but each one of those guys had at least a season or two where their card values were super high, and there was an opportunity to sell for nice profits on a lot of those guys, but they didn't pan out because the expectations were so ridiculously high, and it puts them in a position where they basically have to go out and immediately be a star, and that's just hard, and it's not reality. Very few players in each league are actually stars. It's not going to be every name. So those can't miss prospects, guess what? They absolutely can miss, and they do miss. All right, so hopefully you understand by now that speculating is just tough. It's not that you can't win, it's just that it's difficult to do. So what do we actually do instead? Well, I'll tell you what I like to do. So I call this the seasonal swing play. So once you start to understand the ups and downs of the market, instead of buying cards right before the season to speculate when everyone is excited about that sport and prices are at all-time highs, what I like to do instead is get out ahead of the crowd. And instead of speculating on the players, I like to speculate on the speculators. And so what I'm looking for is I try to understand where is attention going right now. Let's say we're looking at the card market in early spring, right? So baseball is about to get started. Lots of people are super excited about the baseball market. Money's pouring in. You're seeing lots of values at all-time highs. But guess what's not so popular? Football. The Super Bowl is in early February, so by the time the season's over, you have lots of these players who are really good players, up and coming players, but they're out of sight and out of mind. And that creates opportunities to potentially buy good cards of good players for relatively low prices compared to where they will be going into the following season when the same hype cycle that we're seeing for baseball in early spring happens again in late summer for football. Right before the season begins is typically the time when we see values peak. And so, what does this do if we can get out ahead of the crowd and instead of speculating on player performance, we speculate on the speculators? So, here's the thing: we pass the performance upside to the buyer when we're selling before the season. But guess what? We also pass all the risk of underperformance, of injury, like all those charts that we saw fall off of a cliff. We're passing that risk to the buyer as well. And so sometimes the buyer might win, sometimes they might lose. But the types of plays that I like to make are lower risk plays like that, where you can still make really nice money, where you're buying at a time when there's no attention on that sport, and then you're selling at a time when there's maximum attention on the sport. You're not going to see perfect drop offs and rises for every single player where you're just going to be a billionaire overnight. That's not what this is, but there are so many players that fit this same exact pattern. And just like logically, how would you sell like a rising star player if you're buying at a time when no one's paying attention? How would you sell that for less at a time when everyone's paying attention and that's the kind of guy that everyone's looking for? So it puts you in a position where you've got good cards of good players at the right time of year, and then you don't have to take the risk of holding those cards into the season, and you don't have to care about the player and whether they perform or don't perform a certain kind of way. So if you're someone that's loading up on cards of players right before their season begins, you might want to slow down and just reconsider the big picture and understand what you're actually betting on. Make sure you're actually okay with putting your money into this player and counting on them to play a certain kind of way on the field. And if not, then don't put your money there and start looking at, all right, where is everyone's attention? Maybe I can find an opportunity that everyone's overlooking right now. So you got to get a little bit savvy in the market and find ways to get out ahead of the crowd. Speculate on the speculators. Now, if you want help rolling out this strategy in your card business, I actually put together a full, complete guide that breaks down the strategy top to bottom, and it includes a player list of the players that I'm personally considering for the current buying season. It's all a part of Ignite, where we've got over 150 card investors learning, leveling up, sharing what's working and what's not, and helping each other win. It's so much fun. We'd love to see you inside. I'll leave a link in the description if that sounds at all interesting, but otherwise, we'll see you on the next video.